The ferry from Bainbridge Island was 17 minutes late, and I was angry about it for reasons that had nothing to do with ferries. My name is Elias Croft. I was 16 years old, standing in the Coleman Dock Terminal in Seattle with my mother, my sister Nadine, who was 12, and my mother's boyfriend Glenn, who I'd known for 9 weeks and already understood would not last the winter. We were returning from a weekend trip to Glenn's brother's cabin, a trip designed, I think, to make us feel like a family. It had not worked. Mom was on her phone near the vending machines. Nadine sat cross-legged on the tile floor with her sketchbook, drawing the geometric patterns she'd been obsessed with since September. Glenn stood at the window wall facing the harbor, hands in his jacket pockets, performing the role of relaxed adult. I stood apart from all of them because that was my role. The eldest child of a divorce, too old to be managed, too young to leave. The terminal was moderately full. Maybe 150 people spread across the waiting area, commuters, families, a school group in matching green t-shirts, a few solo travelers with roller bags. The 7:40 p.m. sailing had been delayed. The digital board said 7:57 now. Nobody seemed bothered. Seattle ferry delays were like rain. You adjusted. I noticed the Bainbridge boat before it docked was coming in wrong. Not dramatically, not tilted or smoking or anything cinematic. Just wrong in the way that someone who's watched ferries dock 100 times would notice. The angle was slightly off. The speed wasn't decelerating the way it should at that distance. And as it drew closer, I could see movement on the vehicle deck that didn't match the normal pre-arrival choreography of cars starting engines and foot passengers filing toward the exits. People were running. On the car deck, between vehicles, running toward the stern, away from the bow where passengers always disembark. "Mom," I said. She didn't look up. The ferry struck the dock hard. Not catastrophically, the pilings absorbed most of it, but hard enough that several people in the terminal stumbled. The school group's chaperone grabbed 2 kids by their backpacks. Glenn turned from the window with a surprised half-laugh, like it was a novelty. I was already moving toward the doors. Not the embarkation doors, the ones that led to the street. The terminal has a specific layout. Passengers disembark the ferry through a covered gangway into the terminal's north end, then flow through the building and out to the sidewalk or up to the parking garage. The waiting passengers for the next sailing sit in the main hall. The exits to the street are on the south and east sides. The gangway doors on the north wall were closed. They're always closed until the ferry is secured and the bridge crew radios the terminal. But I could hear something through them. Not words. A sound like a stadium crowd heard from outside, diffuse, urgent, wrong in its register. And underneath it, something percussive, irregular, meat hitting metal. "Mom," I said again louder, "we need to go." This time she looked up, saw my face, didn't ask why. "Glenn, get Nadine," she said. But I wasn't moving toward the street exits anymore. I was moving toward the gangway doors, because through the small rectangular windows set in those doors, I could now see what was coming down the gangway. And what I saw made me do something I have never fully been able to explain or defend. 3 people were running down the gangway toward the terminal. Behind them, close behind, were more figures, moving with a speed and coordination that looked like a pack of dogs rather than humans. The runners in front were screaming. One of them was bleeding from the shoulder, arm pumping, legs cycling with the desperate mechanical rhythm of someone who knows they won't make it. I reached the gangway doors. They were held closed by a simple manual bolt, a steel bar that dropped into a floor plate. The kind of thing a terminal worker would lift when the all clear came. I grabbed that bolt with both hands, and I drove it down into the floor plate as hard as I could. Then I grabbed the secondary latch, a chain loop with a padlock that hung open, and I snapped it closed. The first runner hit the door 2 seconds later. A woman, maybe 35. She slammed both palms against the glass and screamed at me. Behind her, the second runner collided with her back. The third was gone, pulled down on the gangway, 8 feet from the door. The woman's eyes locked onto mine through the glass. She was saying something. I couldn't hear it. Didn't need to. I turned around, and I shouted the only word that mattered. Run! Nobody ran. That's the thing about panic in a public space. You'd think the word run, shouted by a terrified teenager, would move people. It doesn't. What it does is make everyone stop and look at the teenager, assess the teenager, decide collectively and silently that the teenager is probably overreacting. A man in a ferry worker's vest actually laughed. Easy, buddy. Then the gangway doors shuttered. The woman on the other side was still hitting the glass, but now the bodies behind her were pressing forward. Nuns, not just the second runner, but the shapes behind him. And they weren't trying to open the door. They were crushing the people between themselves and the glass. The sound it made was enough. The ferry worker stopped laughing. The school group's chaperone grabbed children. Glenn appeared at my shoulder and said, "What the hell?" And then said nothing else, because through the door's window, he could see what I could see. The woman's face pressing flat against the glass, mouth open in a distorted O. And behind her, a man biting into the junction of her neck and shoulder as casually as someone eating corn on the cob. "Exits now, everyone out." That was Glenn. Credit where it's owed. When he understood what was happening, his voice carried authority, mine couldn't. He was 43 and broad-shouldered, and when he shouted it in that specific way, people oriented toward him. The terminal erupted, not in orderly evacuation, in the clumsy, stumbling, belonging-scattering chaos of humans who've been told the room is wrong, but don't yet understand how. I grabbed Nadine. She'd frozen sketchbook still in hand, eyes enormous, fixed on the gangway doors where the glass was now smeared red, and the shapes pressing against it had multiplied from 3 to a dozen. Mom was with us. Glenn was herding the school group's chaperone toward the south exit, and then the south exit opened from the outside. A man burst through it, not running from us, running toward the terminal. Behind him, 2 more people, and behind them, the street. And on the street, I could see cars stopped at wrong angles, and people running, and someone on the ground not moving, while another figure crouched over them with that same terrible mechanical focus. The man who'd come through the door was bleeding from his hand, cradling it against his chest. He staggered into the terminal, and the door swung shut behind him. The people behind him veered off toward the parking garage instead. I understood 3 things simultaneously. First, this wasn't isolated to the ferry. Second, the street was not safe. Third, we were in a building with heavy doors, concrete walls, and limited entry points. I moved before I reasoned. The south exit had a push bar. On the inside, a thumb-turned deadbolt that ferry workers used after hours. I twisted it. The door locked. I heard Glenn shout, "What are you doing?" And I was already running toward the east exit. The east exit led to a corridor, then to a door that opened onto the sidewalk along Alaskan Way. That door was still closed. I reached it, found the same thumb turn, locked it. The main entrance, the one facing the street, had glass doors with electronic locks that I couldn't figure out. But beside it was a security desk, empty now. And behind the desk was a panel with switches labeled by zone. I didn't know which switch did what. I flipped them all down. Something clunked. Several somethings. A mechanical settling throughout the terminal's perimeter. I turned around. The terminal was in chaos. People were screaming, clustering, shouting questions at each other. The man with the bleeding hand was sitting against a pillar, breathing hard. The school group was huddled near the ticket windows, several children crying. Glenn was standing in the middle of the hall, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Mom reached me first. She grabbed my arm, not gently. "Elias, what did you do?" "I locked the doors. There are people outside. I know. People who need to get in. I know." She searched my face for something. Authority, maybe, reason, a plan. She didn't find any of those things because I didn't have them. What I had was a locked building. No understanding of what was happening, beyond the certainty that the things on the gangway weren't sick, weren't confused, weren't people anymore, in any way that mattered. "Elias," Mom's voice dropped low. "Do you know what's happening? Did you see something online? On the news?" "No," I said. "I saw the ferry come in. I saw people running from something. I saw what was chasing them." I didn't know the word for it yet. Nobody in that terminal said the word zombie for another 20 minutes. When someone finally did, a college-age guy with a gaming laptop in his bag, it sounded absurd. But by then, we'd seen enough through the windows to know that absurd no longer disqualified anything from being true. The terminal held 163 people. I know this because in the first hour, while I stood with my back against the locked security panel and tried to understand what I'd done, a woman named Margaret Okafor counted them. Margaret was a logistics manager for the Port of Seattle. She'd been waiting for the Bainbridge sailing to visit her sister. She was 51 years old, shaped like a fireplace, and within 40 minutes of the doors locking, she had become the person people listened to. Not me, not Glenn, not the ferry worker whose name was Dennis, and who kept saying that the Coast Guard would come, that there were protocols. Margaret. Because Margaret did something none of the rest of us could manage. She made lists. She counted people. She inventoried the vending machines, the employee break room, the janitorial closet, the first aid station. She noted the bathrooms, the water fountains, the electrical panels. She asked who had medical training, and 2 people raised their hands. A retired paramedic named Cho, and a dental hygienist who immediately said, "But not that kind of medical." I watched Margaret work, and I felt something I didn't have language for. Not relief, not hope. Something closer to, I have been replaced. The door locking was my only act, and now someone competent has arrived. And I can shrink back to being a 16-year-old who doesn't know anything. Except I couldn't. Because every few minutes, someone would look at the locked doors, then look at me, and their expression would ask the same question my mother had asked. Why? What gives you the right? Who told you to decide for all of us? Nobody said it out loud, not yet, but I could feel it accumulating. The man with the bleeding hand was named Garrett. He was sitting against the pillar, and Cho, the retired paramedic, was wrapping his hand with gauze from the first aid kit. The bite, because that's what it was, a human bite, clear tooth marks in the web between thumb and forefinger, was deep but not arterial. Garrett said a man on the street had grabbed him, said the man had been on the ground, that Garrett thought he was having a seizure and tried to help, and the man bit him. Garrett said this calmly, almost embarrassed, like he was reporting a dog incident to animal control. I watched Cho wrap the wound, and I thought, I've seen enough movies to know what happens next. And immediately I thought, that's a movie. This is real. You can't quarantine someone based on a zombie movie. But I watched Garrett, I watched him from across the terminal for the next hour while Margaret organized. And Glenn tried to get cell signal, and Mom kept Nadine close, and the school group's chaperone, her name was Daniela, tried to keep 14 7-year-olds calm in a way that made my throat ache. Garrett seemed fine. Tired, scared, normal. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that whatever I thought I'd seen through the gangway door, the way the figures moved, the way they coordinated, could have been anything. A riot, drugs, some kind of chemical exposure causing aggression. Then the power went out. Not in the terminal, we had our own generator, which kicked on with a guttural hum that shook the floor. But outside, the streetlights along Alaskan Way went dark. The buildings across the road lost their lit windows in a wave, south to north like dominoes falling. The waterfront went black, except for the headlights of stopped cars, and further out, the ferry still pressed against the dock with its navigation lights burning. In the terminal, the emergency lighting flickered on. Dim yellow strips along the baseboards. The main overheads stayed dark. 163 people pressed together in brownish half-light, watching through plate glass as the city outside went silent, and then, slowly, began to scream. By midnight, 3 factions had emerged. Not formally, nobody called a meeting or drew up platforms. But the geometry of the terminal reorganized itself into zones of belief. The largest group, maybe 90 people, clustered in the center of the main hall, near the ticket counters. These were Margaret's people. They believed in waiting, in signal, in help that would come from outside National Guard, police, Coast Guard. They believed the terminal was temporary shelter, that by morning someone with authority would arrive and tell them what to do. Margaret kept them organized, kept the bathrooms clean on a rotation, kept the vending machine contents rationed into portions. The second group, maybe 40 people, occupied the area near the south exit. These were the ones who wanted to leave. Not all of them, not immediately. But as the hours passed, more people drifted toward that door and stood near it the way you stand near a departure gate when your flight is delayed. They believed the streets had calmed. They believed their cars were close. They believed their homes were safer. Their informal leader was a man named Thatcher, a real estate developer in a Patagonia vest who kept saying, "We can't just stay here indefinitely," as though indefinitely was the plan rather than the night. The third group was the smallest, maybe 15 people, and they gathered in the back corner near the employee break room. These were the ones who'd seen something specific through the windows, who'd watched a human being torn apart under a streetlight while the dying person's legs kept bicycling like a dreaming dog's. These 15 people didn't want to open any door, ever. And when Thatcher's group talked about leaving, the 15 went silent in a way that was louder than shouting. My family fell into none of these groups. We occupied a space near the east wall, me, Mom, Nadine, and Glenn, in a kind of quarantine of our own, because everyone knew I'd locked the doors. And everyone was still deciding what that meant. Nadine hadn't spoken since it started. She sat against the wall with her sketchbook, but she wasn't drawing. She was just holding the pencil, point touching paper, not moving. Mom sat beside her with an arm around her shoulders. Glenn paced. He paced a 3-meter line back and forth, and every circuit he'd glance at me like he was working up to something. On his 9th circuit, he said it. "You locked the south door before we even knew what was happening." I looked up at him. "You didn't ask. You didn't hesitate. You just did it." He stopped pacing. "How did you know?" "I didn't know." "Then why?" "I saw the ferry. I saw what was on the gangway. I panicked." He stared at me for a long moment. "Panicked people run. They don't methodically lock every exit in a public building. He was right, and I had no answer. The truth, the real truth, was that I'd moved on instinct, shaped by 1,000 hours of zombie media consumed since I was 12. Games, shows, movies, books, Reddit threads, survival forums I lurked on without posting. My body had executed a protocol my conscious mind hadn't approved. I'd acted on fiction, and the fiction happened to map onto reality. And now, 163 people were alive or trapped because a 16-year-old had watched too much TV. I guessed, I said. Glenn nodded slowly. Hell of a guess, he said, and walked away. At 2 a.m., Garrett started sweating. I noticed because I hadn't stopped watching him. 3 hours of watching while pretending not to watch, glancing over every few minutes, checking his color, his breathing, the way he held his bandaged hand. The sweat came suddenly. One moment, he was leaning against his pillar, looking tired. The next, his forehead was slicked and his shirt was darkening at the collar and armpits. Cho was asleep nearby. Nobody else was watching. I crossed the terminal. Slowly. Not sure what I was going to do. Not sure what I had the right to do. Hey, I said. You okay? Garrett looked up. His eyes were glassy. Hot, he said. Is it hot in here? It wasn't. The terminal was cold. The generator was running ventilation, but not heating. And it was February, and the concrete held the chill. Can I see your hand? He offered it without resistance. I unwrapped the gauze and immediately wished I hadn't. The bite was angry, swollen, red-streaked, the edges of the wound black in a way that didn't look like normal infection. It smelled like copper and something else, something sweet and wrong. That's not good, Garrett said, looking at his own hand with distant interest. Should probably get that looked at, huh? I'll get Cho. I woke the retired paramedic. Cho took one look at the wound, one look at me, and his face performed a calculation I could read perfectly. He knew. He knew what this probably was. But saying it out loud, in a room of 160 sleeping people, with 14 children present, was a different act entirely. We should move him, Cho whispered. Where? Cho looked around the terminal. Break room. It's got a door. A door with a lock? Cho met my eyes. We were both thinking it. Neither of us wanted to be the one who said, we need to lock a man in a room because we think he's turning into something. His hand's infected, Cho said carefully. Regular infection. We isolate to protect him and others. Standard procedure. That was a lie we both agreed to tell. We helped Garrett to his feet. He was cooperative, even apologetic. Sorry. Didn't mean to worry anyone. We walked him to the break room. It was small, a table, chairs, a microwave, a mini fridge, lockers. Cho helped him lie down on the table. I'll check on you every 30 minutes, Cho said. Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it. Garrett's voice was already thickening, slurring at the edges. We left the break room. Cho closed the door. We looked at each other. We need something to brace it, I said. Cho closed his eyes. He's a person. I know. We can't just... I know, but if he what? Turns? Like a movie? Cho's whisper was fierce. This isn't a movie. It is, I said. It's exactly a movie. Look outside. Cho looked toward the plate glass windows. The waterfront was dark. But in the light of the ferry's navigation beacons, things moved on the dock. Shapes that lurched and then sprinted. Shapes that fell on other shapes. Cho went to the janitorial closet and came back with a mop handle, We wedged it under the break room door handle at an angle against the floor. Then we sat outside the door and waited. At 3:17 a.m., Garrett stopped talking. We could hear him through the door muttering, then groaning, then nothing. At 3:44 a.m., something hit the door from inside. Not a knock, a collision, then another. Then a sustained, mindless pushing, steady as a machine. Cho put his face in his hands. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the door and watched the mop handle flex under pressure that didn't stop and didn't tire. By dawn, everyone knew about Garrett. Not because we told them, because the break room door rattled all night, a sound like someone trying to push a stalled car. And by 5 a.m., people were asking what was behind it. And by 6 a.m., they could hear the sounds Garrett made, not moaning, not groaning, but a continuous low expulsion of air that sounded like a refrigerator compressor running without load. Thatcher's faction used Garrett as evidence. That man was bitten on the street, he told anyone who'd listen. Not on the ferry, not from the gangway, on the street. Which means whatever this is, it's already everywhere. Which means staying here is just waiting to be trapped with the next one who turns. We need to move while we can. Margaret's faction used Garrett as counter-evidence. One man, one bite, contained. That's exactly why we stay. We can manage what's inside. We can't manage what's outside. The 15 in the back corner said nothing. They just looked at the break room door and then at the exits, and their faces said, "Both doors are the same now." At 7 a.m., someone tried to open the south exit. I didn't see who did it. I heard the crash of the push bar being slammed, and then a shout. Frustration, not fear because the thumb-turned deadbolt held. Then Thatcher was there, working the lock, and I was running across the terminal shouting, "Don't!" And Glenn was moving too, and Margaret, and suddenly 20 people were at the south door in a scrum of hands and voices. "You don't have the right," Thatcher jabbed a finger at me. "You're a kid. A kid locked us in here without asking. There are things outside. It's been 12 hours. The National Guard." "There's no National Guard. Look outside. Have you seen a single emergency vehicle? A helicopter? Anything?" Thatcher hadn't. None of us had. The night had passed without sirens, without bullhorns, without the comforting theater of institutional response. The city outside the windows was still. The wrong kind of still. "I'm opening this door," Thatcher said. "Anyone who wants to leave can leave. Anyone who wants to stay can stay." Margaret stepped forward. "If you open that door and something comes in, then we close it again. You can't know that. You can't know how fast they are." "I'm not asking permission." Thatcher reached for the deadbolt. And what happened next is the thing I replay most often. Because I could have let him. I could have stepped back and let a 47-year-old man make his own decision. Let anyone who wanted to leave, leave. It would have been the right thing, the democratic thing, the thing that didn't place a 16-year-old's judgment above 100 adults. But I'd seen the gangway. I'd seen the ferry. I'd heard Garrett turn. And I knew with the absolute, unjustifiable certainty of someone who has no credentials and no authority and no right, that if that door opened, people would die. So I lied. "The man in the break room," I said, loud enough for the crowd. "He turned in 3 hours. 3 hours from bite to that. How many of you were outside before you came in? How many of you got scratched, bumped, touched by someone? Are you sure, really sure, that no one else in here is infected?" The crowd went silent. Thatcher's hand stopped on the deadbolt. "If we open that door, I continued, "and someone here is incubating. We're releasing an infected person into whatever survivors are outside. And if something outside gets in before we can close it, we've got children in here. 14 kids." It worked. Not because it was logical, it barely was, but because it introduced doubt. And doubt, in a room full of scared people, is heavier than conviction. Thatcher took his hand off the lock. He looked at me with something that would become hatred over the next several days. But for now, it was just recognition. This kid is going to be a problem. Day 2. No rescue, no signal, no power outside. The terminal's generator ran on diesel, and Margaret's inventory counted the tank at roughly 72 hours of fuel remaining. After that, no ventilation, no light, no water pressure from the building's pump system. The vending machines were empty by noon. Margaret had rationed them into portions, but 162 people, minus Garrett, plus Garrett's unquiet presence behind the break room door, consumed 6 machines worth of chips and candy bars and bottled water faster than rationing could stretch. The break room mini-fridge had been raided before Garrett occupied the room. The employee lockers yielded lunch bags with varying degrees of sadness, half a sandwich, an apple, a thermos of cold soup. These went to the children first. Nobody argued about that. And the fact that nobody argued about that was perhaps the last point of consensus we'd achieve. I ate nothing on day 2. Not by choice initially, there simply wasn't a portion for me after the kids and the elderly were served. But when Mom offered me half of her granola bar, I refused. And when Glenn gave me a look that said, "Don't be a martyr," I looked away. I wasn't being noble. I was afraid that if I took food, someone would say, "The kid who locked us in doesn't get to eat our rations." And I was more afraid of hearing that said aloud than I was of hunger. Nadine still wasn't speaking. She'd moved from not drawing to drawing obsessively filling pages with the same geometric patterns, smaller and smaller, tessellating toward the edges of the paper. When I sat beside her, she didn't acknowledge me. When I said her name, she said, "I'm working," without looking up. That was the most she'd spoken in 30 hours. Mom pulled me aside in the afternoon. We stood near the east wall where no one could hear us. "She's dissociating," Mom said. "It's a stress response. She needs to feel safe." "She is safe." Mom looked at me. "Is she?" I didn't answer. Elias, the generator, the food, the water. You know what happens in 3 days. Margaret's working on it. Margaret's organizing what exists. She can't create resources from nothing. Mom's voice was steady, controlled. The way she spoke during difficult conversations, the custody mediation voice. "We need to start thinking about leaving." "Not yet." "When?" "When there's somewhere to go." "And how will we know that if we don't look?" She was right. The terminal had windows, big ones, facing the waterfront and Alaskan Way, but they showed limited geography. The dock, a strip of road, parked cars. And in the flat winter daylight, the infected were visible. Not many, not a horde, but present. Individuals moving with that stuttering purposelessness I'd come to associate with them, walking until stimulated, then sprinting toward stimulus with horrifying commitment. We needed information. We needed to know if the world beyond our visible slice still functioned. And the only way to get information was to go outside, or to find someone who already had it. At 4 p.m., someone knocked on the main entrance doors from outside. Her name was Joni, 43, Port Authority police officer, not regular Seattle PD, but the specialized force that handled port and maritime security. She was in uniform, armed, bloodied on one side of her face from a gash above her left ear. She stood at the glass doors and held up her badge and mouthed, "Let me in." 160 people looked at me. I don't know why they looked at me. Margaret was in charge. Thatcher had more to say. Dennis, the ferry worker, technically had operational authority over the terminal. But they all looked at the 16-year-old who'd locked the doors, because apparently locking doors made you the authority on when to unlock them. "Let her in," I said, because she was alone and coherent and armed and wearing a uniform that suggested she knew things we didn't. Dennis opened the electronic lock from the security panel. Joni slipped through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders. Dennis relocked immediately. Joni stood in the terminal dripping not blood, rain. It had started raining sometime in the afternoon, and I hadn't noticed. "Who's in charge here?" she asked. Nobody answered. Margaret half raised her hand. I stared at the floor. "Okay," Joni said. "I'll talk to everyone then." She told us what she knew. It wasn't much, but it was structure. And structure was what we were starving for more than food. The outbreak had begun on the Bainbridge ferry. That was confirmed. Multiple passengers had boarded already symptomatic. The attack on the car deck happened mid-crossing. By the time the ferry docked, the vessel was largely overrun. The gangway disembarkation released infected passengers directly into the terminal dock area, and from there into the waterfront. But, and this was the part that made Thatcher's face go gray, it wasn't only the ferry. Reports before communication collapsed suggested simultaneous outbreaks in at least 6 other locations across the Puget Sound region: SeaTac Airport, the University District, Tacoma's port facilities. This wasn't a local spill. It was coordinated, seeded. Whether by intent or by the pathogen's own logic, it had bloomed everywhere at once. "National Guard?" someone asked. "Deployed to SeaTac as of 9 last night," Joni said. "I have no information past that. Radio's dead. Cell's dead. Station's gone." "Gone how?" Joni's jaw tightened. "Overrun. I was the only one out on patrol when it happened. I came back to bodies and activity." "So there's no help coming," Thatcher said. I didn't say that. I said I don't know. But right now, today, no. There is no active response that I'm aware of. The terminal absorbed this in silence. I watched faces process it differently, some collapsing, some hardening, some going blank. Nadine kept drawing. "How many are outside?" Glenn asked. "Fewer than you'd think," Joni said. "The initial surge moved inland. They follow noise, density. The waterfront's mostly cleared out. There are stragglers, maybe a dozen in our immediate area." She paused. "They're faster than you expect. Don't let the shambling fool you. That's their idle state. Stimulated, they sprint. They don't tire." "Can they be killed?" This from a young man in the gaming laptop group. "Head trauma," Joni said. "Significant head trauma, yes." The word zombie still hadn't been officially spoken in any kind of authoritative context. Joni didn't use it. She said infected. She said them. She said activity. But everyone knew. The lexicon was already loaded in our cultural memory, waiting to be deployed. Joni turned to me. "You locked this place down?" "Yes." She studied me the way Glenn had, looking for credentials behind the action, finding only a teenager in a hoodie and jeans. "Smart," she said. "Ugly but smart." "Ugly?" "You locked out survivors along with threats. People probably died because of closed doors last night." She didn't say it with accusation. She said it like a weather report. "But more people lived in here because of it. Math's ugly sometimes." Day 3. The generator fuel gauge dropped below half. The water pressure from the building system was weakening. The pump was electric and running on the same diesel supply. Margaret calculated. At current consumption, we'd have water for 36 more hours. After that, the taps would go dry. Food was already gone. The last of the vending machine scraps and employee lunches had been distributed the previous evening. 162 people without food, and while 3 days without eating wouldn't kill anyone, it was transforming the social chemistry of the terminal by the hour. People were angry, not at the situation, at me. It started as murmuring, glances in my direction, conversations that stopped when I approached. By the afternoon of day 3, it had crystallized into an open grievance. A 16-year-old had unilaterally imprisoned them, and they were suffering for his decision. Thatcher organized a vote. He stood on a chair near the ticket counters and proposed it plainly. We vote on whether to open the doors. Majority decides. Anyone who wants to leave can leave. Anyone who wants to stay can stay. It was reasonable, democratic, completely logical. And it terrified me, not because I thought they were wrong. By day 3, even I wasn't sure I was right anymore. Joni's report said the waterfront had cleared. The infected had moved inland, toward density. The street outside our windows was empty. More often than not, hours would pass between sightings. Maybe the smart move was to leave now, while the corridor was clear, before our resources hit zero and we were too weak to run. What terrified me was that the vote wasn't really about opening the doors. It was about me, about whether what I'd done was right. And if they voted to open, which they would, because they were starving and scared and rational, then my act would be retroactively classified as false imprisonment, as harm. I would become the villain of their story, the panicking kid who trapped them. I stood against the east wall and watched Thatcher call the vote. Hands for opening, over 100. Hands for staying, maybe 30. The school group's chaperone, Daniela, with 14 kids around her, didn't vote at all. Done, Thatcher said. We open at dawn tomorrow. That gives us tonight to organize groups, plan routes. Wait. Joni stood up from where she'd been sitting near the security desk. You're right that leaving is inevitable, but you're wrong about how. She walked to the center of the hall. You open those doors with 160 people flooding onto the street, and you'll draw every infected in a mile radius. Sound discipline, movement discipline, small groups, planned routes to specific destinations. Thatcher frowned. So you agree we should leave? I agree you can't stay. That's not the same thing. But you think the doors should open? Joni looked at me. I looked at the floor. Yes, she said. I think tomorrow, in controlled fashion, in small groups, the doors should open. The terminal exhaled. The vote had decided. The authority had confirmed. And I stood against the east wall feeling something I hadn't expected, relief. The weight was passing from me. I wouldn't have to hold the doors anymore. Someone competent, someone with a badge and a gun and actual knowledge, had released me from the role I'd grabbed without understanding. I found Mom. Tomorrow, I said. We leave at dawn, first group. She nodded, put her hand on my cheek. Okay, honey, okay. I felt lighter than I had in 3 days. That lightness was a warning I didn't recognize. At 2 a.m. on the 4th night, Nadine spoke. Not to me, not to Mom. To no one, or rather, to the door. She was standing at the south exit with her palm flat against it, whispering. Mom was asleep. Glenn was asleep. I'd been lying awake doing calculations on how far to Glenn's car in the parking garage, which route north, whether the I-5 corridor would be passable, and I looked over and saw my sister's silhouette at the door, talking. I got up quietly. approached. "Come back now if you want," she was saying. "I saved you a space. I'm very organized about space. I can make room." "Nadine." She turned. Her eyes in the emergency lighting were wide and calm in a way that frightened me more than panic would have. "There's a woman outside," she said. "She's been waiting a long time. She's cold." I looked through the door's small window. The street was empty. Rain on pavement. Nothing. "There's nobody there, Noddy. She's just past the light. You can't see her, but she's asking very politely." I knelt beside my sister, took her hand, the one not pressed against the door. Her fingers were freezing. "Nadine, it's the middle of the night. You're tired. Let's go back to Mom." "You locked her out," Nadine said. She wasn't accusing. Her voice was informational. Flat. "On the first night. She was trying to get in and you locked the door and she couldn't get in." My stomach dropped. The woman on the gangway, palms against the glass, mouth open. I hadn't told Nadine about that. I hadn't told anyone the specifics of what I'd seen through that window. But children hear. Children see peripherally. Children assemble narratives from fragments adults think they've hidden. "She's not outside anymore," I said. "That was days ago. She's waiting. Nadine, if you won't let her in, I will." She reached for the deadbolt. I grabbed her wrist. Not hard, but firm, sudden, in the way you grab a child's hand before they touch a stove. Nadine didn't fight. She went limp and her eyes filled with tears, and she said in her normal voice, her 12-year-old voice, "I don't want to be in here anymore, Eli. I want to go home." I pulled her into a hug, and she cried against my chest properly, messily, her body shaking with the sobs she'd been storing for 3 days. I held her and watched the door over her shoulder and thought, this is what I did. Not the locking, not the trapping. This. My sister standing at a door in the dark, trying to let ghosts in, because the living world has become too small to bear. I carried her back to Mom, laid her down. Mom woke, understood without asking, curved her body around Nadine like a parenthesis. I sat up the rest of the night watching the south door. When dawn came, I was the first one standing. Joni organized the departure in groups of 10. Each group was given a destination, the parking garage, Pike Place, the hillside toward First Avenue, and a departure window. 3 minutes between groups to minimize noise overlap. The doors would open and close for each group, then relock. My family was in Group 3, the parking garage. Glenn's car was on level 2. Groups 1 and 2 left without incident. Joni held the door. Cho counted heads. The group slipped out into gray morning drizzle and disappeared north. Nothing pursued. Nothing stirred. Then it was our turn. Mom, Nadine, Glenn, me, plus 6 others assigned to the garage route. Thatcher was one of them, and a couple in their 60s, and 2 college students who'd stuck together through the 3 days. Joni unlocked the south exit, opened it. The air that came in was cold and smelled like seawater. And something else, that sweet metal wrongness that had leaked from Garrett's wound. I hadn't smelled it from inside. Outside, it was everywhere. Faint, but constant. We moved. Glenn in front, Mom holding Nadine's hand, me at the rear. Joni had given me a fire extinguisher. Swing for the head if you need to. Don't spray it. That's useless. I held it by the nozzle like a club. The parking garage was 40 meters from the south exit. 40 meters of open sidewalk. I counted steps. 14, 20, 30. At 32 steps, I heard a sound to my left. A wet, dragging sound, like a heavy bag being pulled across concrete. I turned. An infected woman. She'd been sitting against a dumpster in the alley between the terminal and the garage, invisible in the shadow, was rising to her feet. Not lurching, rising, the way a runner rises from a starting block. Loading. "Go," I said. "Go." The group broke into a run, not coordinated scattering. Glenn and Mom and Nadine sprinted for the garage ramp. Thatcher veered left. The elderly couple froze. The infected woman launched. Not at me, at the couple. They were closest. They were slowest. I swung the fire extinguisher. It connected with nothing because I'd swung too early, from too far away, stumbling forward with the weight of it. The woman passed me by, didn't even register my presence, and hit the elderly man at full sprint, taking him to the ground with a sound like a car hitting a trash can. His wife screamed. The sound echoed off the garage's concrete walls. And from inside the garage above us, in the dark of the upper levels, I heard answering movement. Multiple answering movements. "Get in the car," Glenn shouted from somewhere above. I heard an engine start. I heard tires scream. I ran, not toward the couple, away, up the ramp, past the first level, to level 2 where Glenn's SUV was backing out of a space with the headlights on. Mom was in the passenger seat, Nadine in the back. I didn't save the couple. I didn't try. I ran past them while the woman tore into the man and his wife beat at the attacker's head with her purse, and it did nothing, and I ran. I got in the car, and Glenn floored it down the ramp, and we hit the street at a speed that would have killed a pedestrian. And there were no pedestrians left to kill. And we drove. Behind us, in the mirror, I saw 3 more infected emerge from the garage's upper levels and descend toward the sound of the wife screaming. We drove north. Glenn drove and Mom navigated from memory because phones were dead and the car's GPS had no signal. The plan had been simple. North on 99, then I-5, then to Mom's cousin's house in Bellingham near the Canadian border. 90 miles, normally an hour and a half. We made it 6 blocks. The streets of Seattle were not passable. Not because of infected, we saw surprisingly few in the first minutes, but because of cars. Thousands of cars, stopped, abandoned, crashed, piled. The exodus that had happened while we were sealed in the terminal had left the city's road network a solid mass of dead metal. Glenn tried alleys, tried side streets, tried reversing. At every turn, another wall of vehicles. 20 minutes of increasingly desperate navigation, and we'd covered maybe half a mile. "We walk," I said from the back seat. "No." Glenn, instant. "There's no other. We are not walking through this city with a 12-year-old. We can't stay in the car. When the gas runs out..." "I'm thinking, Elias." Mom was silent. Nadine was silent. The car idled in a narrow space between an Amazon delivery van and a metro bus, and outside the windows, the city was quiet in the way an empty hospital is quiet. The infrastructure of human activity still humming without human purpose. Then Nadine said, "Boats." We all turned. "The water," she said. Her voice was small but clear, her normal voice, her smart voice, the one she used when she'd figured out a puzzle before anyone else. "The zombies can't swim. The water's right there. We take a boat." Glenn opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Mom. "She's right," Mom said. We were 6 blocks from the waterfront. We'd driven away from it. Now we needed to go back. I felt something crack inside my chest, not breaking, but shifting. Because going back meant going back toward the terminal, toward the garage, toward the couple I'd left on the ground. And it meant Nadine, a 12-year-old, non-speaking, dissociating Nadine, had just made the decision that none of the adults could. We abandoned the car, took the emergency kit from the trunk, a blanket, a flashlight, a bottle of water Glenn's brother had left from the weekend trip. We moved on foot, south and west, back toward the water. The walk took 40 minutes. We saw infected 3 times, once at a distance, crossing an intersection 2 blocks ahead, once close, crouched over something in a doorway that we circled wide around, once from behind, following us for half a block before losing interest when a car alarm triggered somewhere east and its head snapped toward the sound. We reached the marina at Pier 66. Small boats, sailboats, a few motorized dinghies. Most were locked to cleats or had complicated rigging. But one, a 20-foot fishing boat with an outboard motor, was tied with a simple line to a dock cleat. And its key was in the ignition because this was Seattle, and people who owned 20-foot fishing boats at Pier 66 sometimes left their keys because who steals a boat? Glenn got the motor running on the 3rd try. Mom untied the line. I lifted Nadine onto the deck. We backed out of the slip and motored into Elliott Bay, and the city of Seattle fell away behind us. And for the first time in 4 days, I felt wind on my face that didn't taste like metal and rot. Nadine sat at the bow. She had her sketchbook she'd carried it the entire time, clutched to her chest during the run, held above water level when stepping onto the boat. She opened it now and began drawing. Not the tight geometric patterns of the terminal days, something looser, water maybe, horizon. I sat in the back near the motor and watched my sister draw, and thought about the elderly couple in the parking garage, and the woman on the gangway, and Garrett behind the break room door, and every person I'd locked out or left behind. And I waited for the guilt to hit like a wave. It didn't come as a wave. It came as a constant, low-grade frequency. A hum, like Garrett's sound through the door. Always there, not dramatic enough to demand attention. Just present. We anchored that first night in the middle of the bay. No one could reach us. Nothing could reach us. The water was black, and the city's skyline was dark, except for scattered fires, orange dots that meant buildings burning without anyone to stop them. Glenn killed the motor to save fuel, and we drifted in silence. The 4 of us in a 20-foot fishing boat with 1 blanket, 1 flashlight, 1 bottle of water, and no plan beyond not being on land. Mom and Nadine slept in the small covered cabin, barely a cabin, more a windscreen with a bench. Glenn sat in the pilot's seat and stared at the shore. I sat on the deck and stared at the sky and listened to water against the hull. "You didn't do anything wrong," Glenn said, after maybe an hour of silence. I didn't respond. "In the garage, the couple. You couldn't have—" "I know. You're 16. I know. This isn't on you." But it was. Not because I could have saved them. I couldn't have. The fire extinguisher was too heavy, I was too slow, the infected woman was too fast. The physics didn't work. But that didn't matter because I was the one who'd organized the departure in my mind. I was the one who'd locked the doors that kept everyone inside for 3 days. I was the one whose decisions had created the conditions in which an elderly couple walked into a parking garage full of things waiting in the dark. I hadn't killed them. But I'd authored the sequence of events that led to their deaths with the same confidence I'd authored the lockdown. Action and consequence. I was good at the first and couldn't escape the second. "Glenn," I said. "Yeah. Thank you for getting us out." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the first nice thing you've said to me in 9 weeks." "I know. Your mom's going to be okay. Nadine's going to be okay. You're going to be okay." I didn't believe him, but I appreciated the intent. I leaned my head back against the gunwale and closed my eyes, and the boat rocked gently, and And somewhere across the water, a building collapsed with a sound like distant thunder, and I slept. In the morning, we motored north, hugging the coastline but staying 50 meters out close enough to see shore, far enough that nothing could reach us. We passed through the locks without stopping. The gates were open, the mechanisms unpowered. Lake Union opened before us, eerily calm, and beyond it, Lake Washington. We saw other boats, a sailboat with 2 people on deck who waved and pointed north and gave a thumbs up, the universal gesture of, "We're okay, keep going." A kayaker paddling furiously south. A Coast Guard cutter anchored far out with no visible crew. At the north end of Lake Union, we pulled into a marina to find fuel. The dock was empty. The fuel pump was manual, a hand crank system for the smaller boats. Glenn pumped while I stood watch with the fire extinguisher, and Mom kept Nadine on the boat. No infected on the dock, no infected visible anywhere. Just empty boats and empty buildings and empty water. We filled the tank and left. Continued north through the ship canal, under the Fremont Bridge, stuck open, into Puget Sound again. Then north along the coast. Edmonds, Mukilteo, Everett. The coastline alternated between burned, abandoned, and simply empty. Nadine drew it all, every mile, her sketchbook filling with loose, quick impressions of coastline and water and the shapes of a world without people. She'd started talking again, not much, not about the terminal, but about what she saw. That building's burned, but the one next to it isn't. Those birds are eating something on the beach. The water's a different color here. Observations, not emotions, but present, engaged. Her eyes tracking the world outside instead of the patterns inside her own head. I watched her and thought, she saved us. Not me, not Glenn, not Margaret or Joni. A 12-year-old who said the word boats and broke the logic of the whole situation. While I was still thinking in terms of doors locked or unlocked, open or closed, she'd thought in terms of a third option I couldn't see because I'd made doors my entire identity. We reached Bellingham on the second day of travel. Mom's cousin's house was a mile inland from the marina, and the walk there was the longest mile of my life. Every step on solid ground, after 20 hours on water, felt like trespassing, like the land had been given to the infected and we were violating their territory. But the neighborhood was quiet. Not empty, there were people. Living people. Lights in windows. A man on a porch with a hunting rifle who watched us pass without speaking. A woman pulling a wagon of water jugs who nodded at Mom and said, "Denise's house is 3 more blocks." Mom's cousin Denise was alive. Her husband Paul was alive. Their house was intact, barricaded competently at ground level, but with the second floor still lit, still heated by a wood stove. They'd been managing. The outbreak had hit Bellingham too, but lighter, more rural, more spread out, more time to react. The neighborhood had organized. Watches, barricades, supply sharing. Something that looked impossibly like community. Denise hugged Mom and cried. Paul shook Glenn's hand. They looked at me and Nadine with the particular tenderness reserved for children who've arrived from worse places. We were safe, actually safe. Not terminal safe, not sealed and slowly suffocating, but functionally, practically, sustainably safe in a house with food and heat and adults who knew what they were doing. That first night, in a real bed, under a real blanket, with walls that weren't concrete and a door I hadn't locked myself. I lay awake and stared at the ceiling and felt the strangest sensation of my life. Irrelevance. For 4 days I had been the person who held the doors, the person everyone looked at and blamed and obeyed and resented. I had been for 300 people's lives, the deciding variable. And now I was in my mom's cousin's guest room, and there was nothing to decide, nothing to lock, nothing to hold. The crisis had passed through me and moved on and left me here, 16 years old, with nothing to be except a kid who'd guessed right once and wrong at least as often. I thought about Joni's word. Ugly. Smart, but ugly. The math. The human cost of correct decisions made without authority. I thought about Thatcher's face when I'd manipulated the crowd with fear. I thought about the woman on the gangway, her palms, her mouth, her eyes. I thought about Garrett's steady pushing against the break room door, about the sound the elderly men made when the infected woman hit him. And I thought about Nadine, standing at the south exit in the dark, whispering to a ghost I'd created. I hadn't saved my family. I'd trapped them, frightened them, and eventually one of them, the youngest, the most fragile, had pointed at the obvious escape that my locked door thinking couldn't perceive. I was the boy who locked doors. She was the girl who saw water. I rolled over. Sleep came eventually. And in the morning, there was breakfast, and it was small, and it was warm, and nobody asked me to decide anything. And the relief of that, the smallness of being a teenager at a kitchen table with nothing to hold, was the closest thing to joy I'd felt since before the ferry came in wrong. That was 4 months ago. We're still at Denise's house. The neighborhood holds. The radio says there are safe zones forming in British Columbia. Glenn is talking about trying for the border when the weather warms. Nadine draws every day. Not the tight patterns anymore. Landscapes, faces, the dog next door. She talks. Not about the terminal. Maybe never about the terminal. But she talks. I don't lock doors anymore. It's a strange thing to notice about yourself, that you leave every door you pass through slightly open. Bathroom doors, bedroom doors. The front door when I come back from watch shifts on the barricade. I leave them open the way a person who burned themselves leaves space between their skin and flame. I was right to lock the terminal. Joni confirmed it. The math confirmed it. I know that. But being right is the smallest thing about what happened. Smaller than the woman's palms on the glass. Smaller than Garrett's hum. Smaller than Nadine at the door in the dark, asking if she could let the ghost in. I was right. And I was 16, and no one asked me. And that combination correct, young alone in the decision, is a weight I'll carry in a specific way. Not as guilt, not as pride. As the knowledge that you can save people and still be no one to them. That a right answer given without invitation earns no gratitude, only the memory of the cage. The water teaches different. The water says, there's always a direction that isn't locked or open. A third thing, a way out that doesn't pass through the door at all. Nadine knew that. I'm still learning.